Hi, I'm James Gardner, host of Your History, Your Story, a podcast for anyone who loves hearing fascinating tales about remarkable people, intriguing topics, and significant historical events. Our hope is to inspire you to uncover and share your history and your story. In this episode of Your History, Your Story, we dive into a unique and often overlooked side of World War II through a captivating conversation with author Robert B. O'Connor. His historical fiction novel, Jeep Show, A Trouper at the Battle of the Bulge, centers on the fictional character Jim Tanzer, a professional dancer-performer who joins the Army and is assigned to special services in a unit known as the Morale Corps. Though Tanzer is fictional, the story is rooted in real events and inspired by true accounts of wartime performers, including well-known figures like Mickey Rooney. O'Connor draws on historical research and personal stories to bring authenticity to the novel, blending fact and fiction in a compelling way. During our conversation, Robert shares how the book came to be, the real-life inspirations behind Tanzer's journey, and the important role of performance in lifting the spirits of troops near the front lines. If you're interested in World War II history, behind-the-scenes stories of the battlefield, or how the heart and dedication of a performer could uplift soldiers in their toughest moments, this episode is for you. I'd now like to welcome Robert O'Connor to our show. Welcome, Robert.
Thank you, James. Really a pleasure to be here.
Now, may I call you Bob?
Please do, although my author name is Robert B., but I go by Bob.
Well, Bob, we're very excited to talk to you today about your new book, Jeep Show, a novel, A Trouper at the Battle of the Bulge. Tremendous book. I've just finished reading it. It's a page turner, and it is so much fun, particularly for people who love history, all aspects of history, actually, not just military. I'd like to start by asking you about your background. Now, I understand from a previous conversation that you have some marketing experience. Could you talk about that, and then also how that led into your first book?
Sure. Upon nearing graduation from college, I talked my way into the Procter & Gamble brand management program. I'm still amazed that I got in there. And so my trade, all my working life has been marketing, which involved all kinds of writing, from copywriting of advertisements and brochures to business writing of memos and recommendations. Procter & Gamble was, and probably still is, a written culture. Around 2004, life just hit me in the face, with a 2x4, not a pie, but a 2x4, and kind of knocked me down for a while. And I got pretty depressed for about a month. And yet I had to go to work anyways. At that point, I owned an advertising agency with another fellow, and I felt I had to show up for work, but I was too depressed or whatever I was to really do much except sit at my desk and kind of journal to myself about how I had contributed to the situation I was in and how I might get out of it. And one day I woke up and I was completely better, but I kept working on that. I kept journaling, and eventually turned it into a nonfiction, what I would call a self-help book for people who read. And that book is called Gumption Aid, the booster for your self-improvement plan. And basically it was me setting down what I have learned through reading and experience and working with smart people and reflecting on how to approach a productive life. So I wrote that I think in about 7 short years. I turned that early journaling into a book. It was very successful as far as reception and copies sold. There is, James, as you may know, there is a huge market for self-help books. So that turned out to be a very effective endeavor for me, and was important for me personally.
Yeah, when you, as you were writing that book, was it like a real passion? Did it feel like something you had to write?
Well, as you know, James, the definition of passion is suffering, and and I certainly was when I began that book. I was certainly suffering, but then as it became a draft of a book, yeah, I think I started to realize that my work going forward would be writing books and stories. You know, we don't always make our living with what our work is, but our work could be, and of course, when we have young children, our work is right in front of us. We're raising
Sure.
children and trying to provide for the family. But moving forward, I guess the excitement for me of writing that book was I realized as I was going, I have a modest talent for writing. And then, this is really how I need to be spending a good hunk of my time. I'm not a gardener. I'm not a golfer. Both excellent endeavors. For me, writing is how I spend my time. So yes, there was a kind of a growing feeling of, wow, I've discovered something here. I'm a good storyteller in writing. I am not a good storyteller, at dinner parties or whatever. I mean, I can hold my own, but I marvel at people that are, just excellent storytellers. For me, I have to write it down to tell a story.
Well, you tell a very, very good story. And when we were researching you and your book for our podcast, I saw that you had this marketing background, that you had written a book which was kind of a self-help book and, successful. And then all of a sudden you're writing a book called Jeep Show. It's a novel and it's a historical novel. So I thought, wow, what a big switch. I really got to meet this guy. And I got to read this book because I come from a business background myself, my whole career, but I love history and I learned that you love history too. Can you tell us about your love of history?
Sure. First, I want to say about your business background, finance, and my business background, marketing. They're both storytelling. In marketing, you are telling stories to potential customers, of how the product or service can make their life better. And in finance, you are telling stories to the CEO with numbers, and sometimes the stories are encouraging and sometimes they're not. But don't think that business people don't tell stories. But so I was having done that nonfiction book and kind of expressed myself and learned that I liked writing books. I was going to start on another nonfiction book about a Procter and Gamble legend called the Oxydol Circus. It could only be done justice in a separate podcast, so I won't get into it too much, other than to say in late 1968, a circus promoter by the name of Jim Hetzer convinced the Oxydol brand manager that sponsoring his circus, his traveling circus, would be a great marketing coup. It turned out to be a marketing disaster, humorous only in retrospect. And again, we don't have time. We'll just leave that one at there. I was interested. It's a legend that Procter and Gamble told over and over and over with great humor. Now that the people responsible are long gone, and I wanted to write that story, nonfiction. I managed to reach Jim Hetzer's daughter. Jim Hetzer died a long time ago, and I managed to reach Jim Hetzer's daughter to get some research on her dad, the circus promoter, and she told me a great deal about his career in the circus. But she added, by the way, you probably don't know this, but my father was an enlisted entertainer in World War II. And I said, no, I didn't know that about your dad. And I also didn't know that there were enlisted entertainers in World War II. She said, oh, yes, military occupation specialty 442, enlisted entertainment specialist. And not only that, but these entertainment specialists did Jeep shows for combat soldiers at the front lines. They went to places where the USO and the Red Cross, which are civilian organizations, excellent ones, could not go. Civilians are not allowed, at the front lines. And she said, and lastly, my father's squad leader was Mickey Rooney. So I said, tell me more. And she said, well, my dad's older sister, my Aunt Mabel, saved every letter he wrote home from training camp and from the European Theater of Operations. And James, I was like, oh my goodness, primary sources, And so I decided that I wanted to write about entertainment soldiers in World War II because this is a forgotten, if it was ever widely known, it has been forgotten. I have talked to several scholars who specialize in World War II, and none of them are aware of the existence of entertainment soldiers. I've talked to, I don't know, hundreds of what I would call in an admiring way World War II nerds, and which I am one now myself. And again, none of them are aware of MOS 442 enlisted entertainers. So I felt this was a worthy topic to write about. And somewhere along the line, I decided that I wanted to write this as fiction, inspired by the life of this real person, but because I wanted to involve this character in the Battle of the Bulge, which was historically one of the most significant battles ever fought by the American Army. It was certainly the largest battle ever fought by the American Army and was very, very significant in the end of World War II in Western Europe and the end of the German army. So that's how I arrived at Jeep Show, a trooper at the Battle of the Bulge. And of course, as you see, James, trooper is spelled in the way that you would address a traveling show person, not a starship, not a starship trooper, because these soldiers were essentially troopers. They did traveling shows for combat infantry.
Yeah, it took a couple glances at the cover to realize that actually.
Yes,
That's how
yes, it
bright I
may.
am.
No, I think it's too subtle, too subtle for my own good.
Yeah. You probably remember, as I do as a kid, watching on television during the Vietnam War. Bob Hope would put on shows in Vietnam and other places where American soldiers were stationed. But those shows were, I would imagine, way, way away from the action that was
Yes,
going on, wasn't
right.
it?
Yes, absolutely. Those were in what would be called the rear echelon, out of artillery and sniper range.
Right. So the other soldiers who were up closer, right on the front lines, and maybe just behind them, didn't have the luxury to sometimes attend these shows. And of course, let me ask you, how I know morale was very important, but was this like right from the top that they figured this is something that they need, even putting those entertainer people at risk?
Oh, absolutely. General Marshall, the ultimate commander of all the American forces during the war, George Marshall, quoted Napoleon's famous quote, which is, morale is to the material as three is to one. So there was a concerted effort by the Army to maintain morale through specific programs. For soldiers in the rear echelon, they wanted to give them things to do so that they would stay out of trouble. Because, a young man with soldiers' pay in his pocket and too much time on his hands, can lead to discipline problems. At the front lines, where life was not only very dangerous, but very uncomfortable. These men were sleeping outside. They were not usually getting hot meals. They were not usually getting the good food. They were getting K rations, a brilliant American invention, but somewhat boring. And they weren't even getting the best clothing. It had a way of getting absorbed in the rear echelon. They were getting plenty of, bullets and shells,
Yeah.
but some of the other things they weren't getting. So they were very isolated up at the front, and these big USO shows, which were brilliant, and I'm full of admiration for Bob Hope and all those performers that interrupted their lives. They were big shows. They were held in the rear echelon, and the enlisted men were always somewhat annoyed by the fact that after the show, the officers would be crowding around the performers and getting to talk to them, and the enlisted men would be, would not be getting a chance to do that. Whereas if you're on the German border in a little town called Hosingen and you're in, E Company of the 28th Infantry Division, and Mickey Rooney and Jim Tanzer and their third performer come to do a show, you're sitting on the ground 10 feet from Mickey Rooney, the Hollywood #1 worldwide box office star of 1939, who's an entertainment genius. And your officers, which might be a second lieutenant and possibly a captain, are standing in the back. So a completely different experience, and one that the frontline combat soldiers richly deserved.
Yeah, I think about Mickey Rooney. How the heck did he make the height requirement for the Army?
Well, the Army lowered it as we really got into the war. The Army's standards lowered considerably on education required, or number of teeth still in your mouth required, or height. Although I don't think it was ever. Mickey Rooney stood a towering 5'1", and I don't think that was ever going to disqualify him from service. He did say it did disqualify him from leading man status. He had a joke that he used during Jeep shows. He said, well, I'm too short to be a leading man and too tall to be a producer. So he was gratefully accepted into the what was called the Morale Corps. And James, it's interesting. As I said, I'm full of respect for Bob Hope. I'm even more full of respect for Mickey Rooney, in that he was under some pressure to enlist by 1943, as were all celebrities of draft age. But he could have done his service at Hal Roach Studios in Hollywood, making films for the Signal Corps, and that's important work. Lieutenant Ronald Reagan did honorable service there. Mickey Rooney chose to kind of jump in with both feet, join the Morale Corps, allow himself to be shipped off to Europe, and then do this somewhat risky, duty, which was these Jeep shows on the front line. I have a theory of why he did that. Mickey Rooney was an absolute genius. He was a brilliant actor and so recognized by the directors he worked with. He was outstanding stand-up comedian. He did brilliant impressions. He played the drums at a professional level. Instead, he learned to play the banjo in one day. He was an excellent dancer. So he was nothing short of an entertaining genius. As you know, where there are great strengths, there are corresponding weaknesses. And his weakness was his private life was completely off the rails. Hard Partier doesn't begin to describe Mickey Rooney's life in Hollywood before the war. Among other things, he was married to Ava Gardner, the most beautiful woman in Hollywood, and he cheated on her. My theory is that some part of Mickey Rooney knew that this life in Hollywood was killing him, and and that he needed away from Hollywood and away from that life. And what better way than to get right up near the trenches on the German border in mid-1944 and be doing what he's so good at, which is entertaining and ad-libbing. So my theory is that he felt at some level he needed to get away, and get away he did.
Yeah, he did. And the main protagonist in your novel is Jim Tanzer. So he's the sort of the fictionalized character of Jim Hetzer, the man in the circus with Oxidol. So how does the real Jim versus your Jim compare? Where do they come together and where do they go apart?
Well, Jim Tanzer, the protagonist in the book, is inspired by the life of Jim Hetzer and also by another soldier who became a college professor after the war and wrote a very, very good autobiography. So it wasn't all about this one real person, Jim Hetzer. What I'll say is, with a fictional character, you can have so much more happen to them in a short time than is going to happen to a, real person for the most part. So the genesis of creating the fictional character was I wanted to tell the story of many, many things that could not have happened to a real character. So the biggest of them is I stuck this character at the front lines, and he gets left behind for some reason or another at the front lines the day before the Battle of the Bulge starts. And so he is caught up in the Battle of the Bulge, kind of makes a fighting, stumbling retreat along these day by day along these significant places during the Battle of the Bulge, and of course ends up in Bastogne. Uh, I could not have, told that story if it wasn't completely made up. And then there were many adventures along the way that again were borrowed from many different sources or just completely fabricated in my mind. And what I want to say about historical fiction is you have to get the facts right about what happened, when, and where. Your research has to be to make the book really entertaining to history buffs. Your research has to be very, very stringent. But once you've gotten the, if you will, the structure of the story completely historically accurate, you can take your main character and you can make up all sorts of things that happened to him. And of course, he had three or four or five soldiers worth of happenings. You may recall some of his adventures in London, and that one of those stories came from one soldier's diary, and another story came from another soldier's diary, and so that's why you create a fictional character is you can have him represent many, many different things, and never spend a minute relaxing throughout the whole book.
Yeah, I think he reminded me of was the movie Forrest Gump, where everything happens to this guy. He's everywhere. Everything that ever happened in history happens to this guy, and it's brilliant. It really is. But I thought your protagonist was kind of like that in a way. I mean, here, first of all, he's an unusual character in the first place, in that this is an entertainment person on the front lines. You know,
Now, remember, James, he tried to make it in show business in New York before the war, and other than a brief appearance at the New York World's Fair, emceeing for a robot, he was not successful. And he's kind of an everyman. I mean, not, he is an entertainer by trade. Really, he makes his living as a dance instructor, but he's kind of an everyman. And I love that you mentioned Forrest Gump, because one of my favorite reviews of the book was one sentence long: Band of Brothers meets Forrest Gump. That is so, I hadn't thought about it that way until I read that review, but now I can't get that out of my mind. It's so accurate. So yes, making it fiction allowed me to borrow and reshape many, many, many different soldier stories and have them all happen to one. I will also add, I read somewhere that all fiction is autobiographical, and I have thought, all along as I was writing that to some extent I was also imbuing this protagonist with some of my own, thoughts and feelings, and as I said, he kind of caught on day one at the front line of the Battle of the Bulge, and the Germans made great progress for several days. This character is essentially doing a stumbling, fighting retreat until he gets to Bastogne, where it is imperative that he and the others turn and fight. I've often felt in my own life that there's been periods of stumbling, fighting retreats, and then I get somewhere and I turn and fight. So I think that that major theme of life came from my imagination and my own limited self-understanding as much as anything.
I really like that. And it kind of ties in with why you wrote your first book. There seemed to be, you were kind of stumbling
Oh, definitely.
and retreating, and you had to turn around and fight. And you
Yeah.
said you turned it around and then you
Yes.
wrote about it. So I like that. But I noticed that just a few things that your character, Jim, Jim Tanzer runs into.
Mm.
I mean, you mentioned London. He's got I guess it was the V2 rockets at that point.
Yes. Yes.
He's in France and all the going on there. He deals with black market dealers.
Yeah.
There's some race issues that come up in it as well. There's also concentration camp situations that he
Yeah.
runs into,
Yeah.
the Russian, allies that they ran
Right.
into,
Right.
and things like that. But there's so many different things and the characters that run through the book. What I wanted to ask you from a standpoint of, well, first of all, before we proceed with how you other ways that you researched this book and wrote about it, just tell us a little bit more for our listeners about the Battle of the Bulge. Now we're talking about
Sure.
late in the war, right? It's like the end of 1944.
Exactly.
Didn't we at that point we kind of the Allies thought we had this done, the Germans were just about done?
There was a Home by Christmas was a rueful joke. Yeah. The largest battle ever fought by the U.S. Army went from December 16th, 1944 to January 25th, 1945. It was the Germany's last offensive on the Western Front. Hitler had a wildly unrealistic plan where he would attack West by surprise, and he did achieve complete surprise. And he would split the Allied armies, that is, the Americans and the British, in half. And he would drive all the way to the crucial port of Antwerp, where all the material was being shipped and unloaded. And then he would, having accomplished that, he would then make a separate peace with the Allies and be able to turn all his forces to the Soviets in the East, who were rapidly approaching Germany through Poland. His generals opposed the plan, wanted something much more achievable. It was a desperate gamble, almost certainly unlikely to pay off, and it did not pay off. But nonetheless, the battle was fierce. The Germans attacked with three armies, the 6th SS Panzer, the 5th Panzer Army, and the 7th Army. And the American forces, three divisions, were stretched very thinly across this part of the front lines. They were essentially biding time, reinforcing, replacing casualties, and waiting for a spring offensive into the German heartland. It's called the Battle of the Bulge because although it was about 100-mile front, a huge battle, the Germans only made progress right in the middle. So they made, I think about 25 miles west and created a quote unquote bulge in the American lines. This was about 200,000 German troops and about 1,000 German tanks facing about 80,000 American soldiers. Later in the battle, after the first few days, it was fought in very harsh winter conditions. It was the coldest winter in Europe in memory. And so both sides had to deal with extreme cold and snow and ice. And what helped the Germans was the weather for the first about 4 or 5 days was very overcast. So the complete air superiority of the Allies was not able to be brought into play. As you know, James, from reading the book, around the fifth day, American planes start to appear in the sky over Bastogne to the great relief of the beleaguered defenders. German losses in the battle were substantial, greatly depleted their remaining stores of men and equipment, and it remains a strong testament to the resilience and spirit of the American Army as they overcame, this massive surprise attack by the German army. So that's kind of the capsule summary of the Battle of the Bulge, a huge historic event.
Oh, yes. And I don't know if you remember this movie, but one of my favorite movies as a kid
Yeah,
was the Battle of the Bulge. I think Henry Fonda was in it, and
I've
some of
seen
the,
it.
well, I love that movie. I think one of the consultants was Omar Bradley, General Omar Bradley. I think he was still living then.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
they would make that. The only thing I didn't care for in that movie is they filmed it in Spain. So you see these German tanks rolling across, Spanish prairie almost or whatever. And the Ardennes is it's a perfect tank country in somewhere in Spain. The Ardennes is very poor tank country. There's many, many uh, dense woods. They were actually commercial forests, believe it or not. So they were incredibly dense. There's rolling hills. The terrain is very uneven. In the winter, of course, it's very snowy and icy. So the movie did not portray those conditions on the ground, but overall, it did tell the story.
oh, tremendous actors, I'll tell you. But I noticed in your book, your writing style, two things stood out to me. A lot of dialogue between the characters.
Yes.
And the other thing is that within each chapter, there was a flashback that sort of brought you from your protagonist's earliest days,
Yeah.
right up to, I guess, the point where he, goes into the army. So
Right.
why did you choose those two methods?
Well, first on dialogue, when you're writing nonfiction, you could just tell the reader what you want them to know. When you're writing fiction, if you just tell the reader what you want them to know, they get bored and they skip ahead. So the best way to show them what you want to know is to have people talking to each other, and thus, giving information both to each other and to the reader at the same time. And it's always good to create a character who has to have everything explained to him by the people in the know. In this case, I created a character, the war correspondent, who explains to Jim Tanzer what's going on at the 30,000-foot level. Jim is on the ground, retreating, fighting, retreating, scared, cold, whatever. And the war correspondent can explain to him, at the big picture of what's going on, and thus explain to the readers. So that was why I used a lot of dialogue. It's a way to let the readers in on what you want them to know without boring them. Would you tell me again the second part of the question, James? I got so involved with that I
Oh,
forgot
no, no, that was a great
it.
explanation. I think the other part was that within each chapter you did a
Ah,
flashback.
yes, yes. I will admit to you and to your listeners that I dramatically over-researched this book. And thus, one of the very short flashbacks, for example, is a very young Jim Tanzer watching a vaudeville show. Well, in the draft that I shipped to my editor, that was an entire chapter, and it went into great detail on every act in the show. And personally, I thought it was brilliant. And then the next chapter, there's a short flashback of a slightly older Jim Tanzer watching Billy Sunday, the famous revivalist,
Up.
doing a tent revival. Again, that was a 30-page chapter. I went into all sorts of very interesting detail about Billy Sunday's life and these kind of events. And my editor said, Bob, you cannot leave the readers hanging on your story. You cannot take them for 30 pages while they're trying to follow, Jim Tanzer's progress from one place to another. So those flashbacks, with tears in my eyes, I dramatically reduced those flashbacks. So they just give a hint of what life was like in the late 20s or the mid 30s during the Depression. And if I write another book, and I hope to, I'm going to figure out my plot before I do too much research.
Yeah, but that research is so much fun, isn't it,
It
Bob?
is. Research is fun and writing is hard.
And writing it is hard. I know Kelly gets on me a lot. I've done a lot of family research.
Ah,
My
good.
family, it's been great. And Kelly says that's fantastic. But James, if you get hit by a bus, that your kids aren't going to know who any of these people are because you don't write anything down. I have a
Yeah.
research.
Yeah.
So I wanted to make a couple of comments.
Yes,
First of
please.
all, on the dialogue, what I thought that you did magnificently was that you've captured the language, the speech of the 1940s. That could be very dangerous using dialogue in 2025 when you're trying to talk like somebody in the 40s. Have you ever seen a movie or a TV show where it's supposed to take place and they say things that you know they didn't say back then, and you'll see something even on the set that wasn't there? How did you capture that language or some of the terms, you know what I mean,
Yeah.
that people use?
Yeah. Well, one word that was used constantly that shows up in the book that we don't use in this term anymore is the word swell. Hey James, your podcast, it's really swell. We don't use that term. So I started with that. You have to be careful with dialect in that it's a little like Tabasco sauce. A little goes a long way. And I wanted to capture the flavor of how people talked with authentic slang terms that were used in the day and then authentic ways of talking. So one thing I did is, of course, watch movies from that time period. I watched several movies. I read The Maltese Falcon and several other, I think it's called noir, detective stories because they really they really go crazy on the dialect and the slang in those, and you can pick from it what you need. I've always been fascinated with British accents. I spent a year in England as a young man, and so, when the crew members of the Queen Mary are talking, I have them talking with some British dialects and with British slang. My goal was not to overdo it because, again, if you throw in too much dialect and too much slang, the reader's just going to skip ahead. It just becomes too hard to follow the story. So I hope that I got just the right amount.
Yeah, you did it. It wasn't overdone as far as I'm concerned. And I have read
Right.
books that have overdone it, in my
Yeah.
opinion, anyway, and you get sort of bogged down in it. But it's funny, I interviewed a fighter pilot from World War II a few years ago. His name was Bud Anderson. He was, I think, one of the last living
Mhm.
triple aces at the time.
Ooh,
And
yeah.
he was recounting a dogfight he was having with a German fighter. And anytime he was describing it in detail, when he hit the enemy plane,
Hmm.
say hot dog. And people don't say that anymore.
Yeah.
Just
Yeah.
dog. What
Yeah.
do you mean hot dog? You know what I mean?
Right. Right.
But
Right.
yeah, the language that was used, but also when you were recapping or going back in Jim Tanzer's history, and you were talking about the vaudeville shows
Hmm.
and I guess they talked about ventriloquists or
Yes. Yes.
different shows that were put on and different performers. I mean, Burns and Allen, I heard, and
Right.
other even more who are more obscure than them, whose names you brought up. You must have, did you have a passion for entertainment history, or did you learn about this stuff just for this project?
I learned about this stuff just for this project. And of course, once you get into it, if you're curious, it's absolutely fascinating. Vaudeville was the dominant professional entertainment form in America from about the late 1860s until those things we now call moving pictures until moving pictures arrived in the mid 20s. And even then, as is in the very short flashback of the vaudeville show that young Jimmy sees, they combined vaudeville with a short film, but by the end of that decade, by the end of the vaudeville was essentially dead. This, leading entertainment source for like 50 some odd years, was killed by moving pictures. However, it was kept alive in Jeep shows and USO shows to some extent. It was kept alive. And then people our age remember the Ed Sullivan Show, which was, essentially a vaudeville show packaged for television. So the variety show lives on, but the vaudeville touring companies are long gone.
Yeah, if we could reflect together for a moment, since I think we're
Yes.
an age at least, I would say that here it is 2025, and I don't think of us as old guys at all. I think we're pretty young, right? But we do in our lifetime, those old vaudeville people were still entertaining. My wife Kelly and I went to see Bob Hope back in the 80s. He was up here in New Jersey. George
Yes.
Burns used to be on all kinds of shows.
Yes. Yes.
You had Jack Benny, these people who many of them had gotten their start on vaudeville, these tremendous
Oh, all
entertainers, weren't they?
all of them of that era got their start on vaudeville, from Bob Hope to Burns and Allen. Interestingly, and I'm not a historian of entertainment, but there were vaudevilles, let's say there were 100 brilliant vaudeville stars. Then radio comes along, and I don't know, 10 or so of those transition successfully to radio. Burns and Allen, did. The ventriloquist Edgar Bergen and his friend Charlie McCarthy, believe it or not, even though he was a ventriloquist, they transitioned successfully to radio. And then in starting in the mid 1950s, television comes along, and a few of those, and Burns and Allen were certainly one of them. They had their own very successful comedy show on broadcast television. So there were these entertainers of that era: Bob Hope, Burns and Allen, Edgar Bergen, and Charlie McCarthy, just to name a few, went through three completely different eras of entertainment technology. Fascinating topic. I ought to write a book on that, but
You really should. I mean, you you bring in stories of human cannonballs and all those things.
right, right.
Can
The
these people get life insurance?
The Zaccardi family, and this was based again on a real family. The family business was human cannonball acts. So, yes, an interesting way to make a living.
Imagine that on your tax return, occupation.
Right,
And
right, right.
you'd be audited pretty quickly.
Oh my Lord.
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
absolutely.
So Bob, one of the other things that really struck me, and I found it fascinating, was your knowledge of military language, military World War II weaponry,
Yeah.
kind of where the troops were and things like that. I know it was a fiction, but there again, you're going to have ex-military or current military people reading this, and you had to really be right on target for the terms you were using. How did you do that?
Well, first of all, I knew that I needed to be. Second of all, I became deeply interested in, I didn't try to get to the bottom of every weapon system. I essentially became deeply interested in three things that frontline combat infantry had. One was the bazooka. Another was the M1 Garand rifle, semi-automatic rifle. And the third was the field jacket that infantry was given. And each of those had its own story. For example, I will tell you the bazooka, which was called the rocket launcher. Bazooka was just a nickname. It was called the M1 rocket launcher. The thing ran on one D cell battery.
What could go wrong?
So there you are, trying to damage or destroy a German tank. You're essentially, your life is on the line while you're in a shooting position, and you're dependent on one D cell battery. Now there is a replacement battery in the stock of the thing. So as you recall, the main character almost by accident becomes an expert in the bazooka. And then he spends much of the rest of the time trying to avoid being issued a bazooka and doing the dangerous job of trying to shoot German tanks. The M1 Garand rifle was many people said it was the most important weapon in the war, semi-automatic, fired a clip of 9 rounds. There's a little Easter egg in the book. There was something called Garand thumb, where when you loaded a new clip, the bolt would, after you jammed the clip into place, the bolt would slide back with great force. And if you were inexperienced or unlucky, your thumb was trailing in the area where the bolt would slide back, and you would end up with a very painful injury to your thumb and a bruise that would be there for months. And although I don't mention M1 thumb by name, at one point Jim looks down at his bruised thumb and just thinks, I do not love my M1 Garand rifle. And then the last, which in some ways is my favorite, is the field jacket that Army infantry wore. It was essentially, olive drab, tightly knit cloth. They would layer things under it for the cold, but it had 4 gigantic pockets, 2 breast pockets and 2 hip pockets. And essentially, for combat infantry constantly on the move, it was a suitcase. Combat infantryman would reach into his pocket and pull out his toothbrush, a hand grenade, clips for his M1 and several letters from home, and then in the other hip pocket would be 2 or 3 K-ration boxes. And they didn't want to carry knapsacks. They were too easily lost or stolen. Almost all combat infantry took their gas masks out of the gas mask holder, threw the gas mask away, and used that for storing ammunition and sandwiches, for all we know. So I did a lot of research listening to, on the weapons and the equipment that were the most important to the story. And then, tried not to make any mistakes on other things like the C-29 Skytrain. I think I just made a mistake on that designation, by the way. Trying to understand, the role that different aircraft played and the role that artillery played during the Battle of the Bulge.
It's a novel. Anything can happen, right?
Exactly right.
That struck me. I think it was so rich. And as I was reading it, I said to myself, this is a history lover writing this.
Yeah.
You want it all in there. You're just filled with all this information and it's exciting. And you want people to know about it. And I think that you've really created a character who's kind of like, he's like taken along for this ride,
hmm
and
hmm
he's experiencing so many things. And what's interesting is the time that he enters the war. It's late in the war.
Right. Right.
He comes in, and I guess he it's in 43 initially.
Very late 43, he enlists. He was 30, the character, when he enlisted, and he was already the father of a young child. And the draft boards did not draft fathers of children. So he did not have to join. And I leave it to the reader to try to parse out some of the more complicated reasons why he joined the Army at age 30 when he didn't really have to. Obviously, patriotism was one of them, but I think there were other more personal reasons as well.
Boy, that's incentive to become a father pretty quickly, isn't it?
Yes, it
I
absolutely
didn't know
is.
that. That I didn't know. I mean,
Yeah,
I suspected it, but I
right.
wasn't sure
Yeah,
of that. Yeah, so it's a wonderful book, and just just to tell our listeners, there's some great interaction with the Jeep Show guys, with Mickey Rooney and Jim Tanzer, and then there's another gentleman who's an accordion player.
yes, Wes. Wes is the son of immigrants from Czechoslovakia. And there was I can't remember the name, many gathered in a town in Texas. And they're still there, by the way, still speaking Czech. So, yes, Wes is an accordion player and one of the enlisted entertainers.
Yeah, and there's something that's on your website that talks about the citizen soldier of World War II.
Yes.
And we could quote the website in a moment, but it certainly was largely a civilian army, like vastly,
Yeah.
I guess, civilian army, and that they were dealing with this war, and they were away from home. I think in this, you're sort of, these people are sort of interacting, and they had other professions, they had other lives,
Right.
they were doing
Right.
different things. What was your perspective on the citizen soldier while you were doing this project for the book?
I'm really glad you asked, and it's one of my biggest takeaways that I learned while doing the research and writing the book. We'll start with the fact that the American Army, by the end of the war, all the other armies were shrinking assets. The American Army was growing in power and strength at the end of the war. The American Army was much larger than the Navy and the Marine Corps and the Army Air Force combined. So the American Army, unlike the Navy and the Marine Corps and the Army Air Force, the American Army had to rely almost exclusively on the draft. Because of that, the Army, unlike the other branches, represented the country as a whole. So the Army drafted PhDs, the Army drafted men with a fourth grade education, the Army drafted, middle class and upper class young men, the Army drafted young men like the one my father knew in the war, who said that his Army boots were the first pair of shoes he'd ever owned all by himself.
Oh, wow.
So the Army was the melting pot, was the representation of the country as a whole. The Army even drafted immigrants or sons of immigrants who had to be taught English while in the Army so that they could understand their orders. And many of them were Italian speakers who ended up fighting in Italy, or German speakers that ended up fighting in Germany. What I have the war correspondent say, he writes a column at the end of the war, and I think the most important part when he's talking about the Army as a whole is he says, and this is just fiction, but he says America fielded millions of citizen soldiers who disliked the damn Army, were ambivalent about their officers, and resisted the trappings of military hierarchy. Yet many of them will remember their service as the ennobling experience of their lives. If you ask them, they will tell you they fought not for their country or for lofty ideals, but for each other, for their buddies, to get the job done and get home. These were citizens first and soldiers second, and this was very different than the other armies in the war. They voted, their wives and mothers wrote angry letters to their congressmen. The American Army in World War II was a completely unique and historic organization. We'll never see the likes of it again, I don't think, and I don't think we had seen it before on that scale. So that my biggest takeaway from writing was what an important and unique and historic organization the Army was, and how American it was in that these were citizens first and soldiers second.
Yeah, wow, that's crazy. And to think there's so few of those soldiers left today. I think there's been a big uptick in interest in World War II. And I know people are going to really love your book, and I hope people go out and buy it. A couple things. First of all, could you give us the name of your website again?
Sure. My website is jeepshowbook.com, and there's additional content there, including this newspaper column written by the war correspondent that kind of summarizes how things looked to him at the end of the war. And he makes a mention, without name dropping, he makes a mention of these entertainment soldiers that he met.
That is great. And you're also, I understand, going to be making a donation from the proceeds?
Yes, I'm giving $1 per copy sold to an organization called Shields and Stripes. Shields and Stripes offers physical and mental rehabilitation help for veterans and first responders. And as you know, many first responders are veterans as well. So it's a double there. And I have met these people. I'm very impressed with the organization. And I told them I would have given them all the profits from the sale of the book, but $1 per copy is way more.
Let me ask you what's next? Do you have anything on the drawing board that you can tell us?
Yes, I have begun a sequel to the book. Jim Tanzer is going to go to college on the GI Bill. Many younger people don't know, but the GI Bill, which was Congress voted, approved in very late 44, really changed the fabric of American society in that it sent millions of veterans to college essentially for free. And many of these men, like my father, came from working class backgrounds and would never have really considered or been able to afford going to college. So, 6-7 million men, veterans like my dad, all of a sudden have received a college education and are out in society doing, professional white collar type work, and then their children get college educations as I did. So I want to send Jim to college. Of course, he's going to be very old for college, as many of the veterans were. I want to explore that in a story, and then also he may get caught up in the Korean War in some way, shape, or form, 1951 to 53.
Jim Tanzer's wife is going to be very mad at you.
Yeah, well, she is, of course, far more talented than he is, and yes, has to find her way. I'm not quite sure what she'll do in the sequel.
Well, Bob, thank you for being on our show. I highly recommend Jeep Show, a Trouper, Trouper, at the Battle of the Bulge. Terrific book. I highly recommend it. And thank you very much for being a guest on our show. And I wish you the very best with your writing. Keep it up. You do a fantastic job.
James, thank you. It's really been a privilege to talk to you. You're a very knowledgeable and talented host, and the podcast is outstanding. I listened to several episodes to prepare. It's really, really outstanding. Well done.
Thank you, and have a great day.
Thanks. It's been great. Take care.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Your History, Your Story. Don't forget to follow us on YouTube, Facebook, X, and Instagram to stay connected. We'd love to hear from you, whether you have questions, comments, or a story to share. Until next time, be well and God bless.